thank you for presenting this, I think, very intimate and provocative film that I think brings another side of Indonesian culture, well, really part of the culture that's of the world. I would say these are things that we all deal with, and it's always so powerful when you start to know particular families, because all of the idiosyncrasies, all of the aspects that are the psychology, even the psychosis of those particularities are really what start to emerge. And I realize this has been an incredibly challenging film to put together because there are so many choices. And I'll just say by way of reference, I've spent the last 40 years involved with Balinese culture, particularly the music, dance, and the ritual life. So this is another part of society, and there are so many aspects, I think, socially, that I'm hoping we will have a chance to look at, and then open up and look at some of the solutions and some of the needs in the society. But Rob, could you talk first about the kind of, you mentioned it briefly, but if you could go a little bit further about the process of creating the film.
Yeah, so we've been going back to Indonesia every year since the mid-90s, several times a year. And it's really been kind of a bit of a snowball effect because we've probably now shot 9,000 or 10,000 hours on a variety of subjects on mental illness, genocide, genderized violence, ritual, I mean, a whole range of topics. So this was one of a number, but we were having a discussion earlier about ethics, and I'm sure the question often comes up because this is such intimate material, and we're really exposing people's lives in very, very intimate aspects of their lives. So we've taken our ethical obligations very, very seriously. I mean, I was recently reading an article on the making of the Borat film, and Sacha Baron Cohen's film, and that's on one end of the ethical problematics of documentary filmmaking. So when they went to this town in Bulgaria, a Roma town, they paid people $3 and they lied to everyone. And so that's on kind of one end about how films can be made. In terms of making this, we have a continual ethical conversation with our subjects / collaborators and friends, because people become really your friends after working with them year after year. And we have a continuous discussion of the meaning of their participation, the meaning both for them personally, for their relationships within the family, for their relationships in the community, if these aspects of their lives are brought out and exposed on screen, because screen lasts forever. And so I feel like we've done far beyond the typical IRB informed consent, in that it's a continuous process, year in, year out. In fact, we've been doing a series of screenings with a number of the women who are in the film, who go to Balinese villages and discuss their experiences, discuss domestic violence, HIV, customary law, all the issues that the film raises. And I've been very lucky because Livia and I have been working together for over a decade, and Livia's really informed me a lot about the conditions that not just Balinese but Indonesian women live in this very diverse society, and has really kind of educated me about what solutions, and maybe Livia, if you could talk about some of the work that you've done in these domains with women and families. Yeah.
Thank you, Pak Rob. So I'm a psychologist, and as was introduced by La earlier, I co-founded the PULIH. PULIH means recover in Bahasa Indonesia. Center for Trauma Recovery and Psychosocial Empowerment, and we work with survivors of different kinds of violence and also conflict areas also, and and disaster-affected areas. With the disaster-affected areas, you work in a more community level. With the domestic violence, for example, of course, you do more individual work. And polygamy often comes up in as a major factor of psychological distress. I mean, I've had actually had a good friend whose father is Balinese, and her mother just had a heart attack and just died like really instantly after she found out that he has been keeping another wife for the last 7 years, for example. And so we had to kind of work with that. And I've also had to work with women who gave up everything, like they were educated and also come from middle-class background and all that, and gave up everything in terms of no working and totally dependent on the husband, and then finding out that they were not the only ones, and then kind of became so frustrated. And then I think with middle-class women, it's harder because of this social status that they want to kind of suffer in silence. And she almost committed suicide, actually. And I had to deal with about 3 cases like that. And but we managed to kind of work through some of the issues and stuff. Yeah, so.
I mean, there are really multiple levels that this is all taking place on. One level is the changes in society, and you bring that up in the film. Even though we don't get to see it per se, because we're so close with the characters, the role of tourism, the role of opening up, the changes, the kind of divisions that come in society become a major part of some of these changes, particularly with Dharma and Sadra. Patwajan is a whole other other story, and it's almost like an older world. But what is so powerful is giving voice to these women, and to win a kind of trust that people. There is a sense that the people in the film want to tell their story, and even the young people, that there's some sense of self-consciousness of what does this mean in this context. So maybe we could start there. I have a couple other questions that I'd like to start with, kind of staying in Bali, and then maybe widening out.
So the question is?
So the question really is, oh, you didn't get it? Which one do you want?
That they were able to speak up.
Well, yes, that you gave voice, that there was intention to give voice, and that over 7 years, people wanted to give voice.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because if we go back to the original interviews, doing long-term field work or documentary ethnographic filmmaking, it's so proverbial onion, because the first interviews we did with Pak Dharma and his wives, everything was fine, everyone gets along, there's no economic problems, everyone's happy. I mean, that was really largely the first year. And once you establish relationships, establish trust, become really, in some ways, part of their lives, then you start uncovering really what's more at stake in these women's lives. And it's also interesting that the focus of the film shifted, because the first earlier cuts we did, we now in retrospect rather foolishly focused on kind of the men's stories. And then we realized that this really wasn't, we certainly have that in the film, but the more powerful and poignant stories are the stories of the women struggling with all the issues that the film illustrates. So,
but I think they're very brave women, because have you tried to interview Japanese women, Pak Rom, and would they be as forthright as as these women? Do you think?
I mean, that's an interesting question.
Yeah. Because,
What about Minang?
No, that would be totally different.
As people know, we have a lot of ethnic groups in Indonesia, and some ethnic groups are more assertive than others. Like, but particularly with domestic violence, a lot of women in Java, they want to suffer. They then choose to suffer in silence, or even we say membisu demi harmony. Harmony, to just remain silent, just to remain, to keep the harmony. Mm-hmm. And it's actually very hard to get them to speak about it. And usually the turning point is when their children actually suffer and are showing signs of acting out, or like you saw that the first son he said that when he was bigger he would come out, and then the father did not dare beat the wife. So I mean, in a way that's protective of the mother, but they're also, when they were smaller, and then they also experience the violence. It's usually with the women who come to seek help. It's actually the turning point in which they decide to leave the marriage. And I'm not talking about Balinese women specifically. These are the women in Jakarta who come from different levels, socioeconomic levels, and seek the psychological help. Yeah.
This is certainly one of the issues that Bali has such a low divorce rate, and one of the points of ethnographic film is relating culture, a big C culture, and as a psychological medical anthropologist, relating culture to personal experience. And one of the things that certainly emerged in the making of this film and in doing the research is the power of culture. This culture determining patrilineal and patrilocality, so the women move to the men's compounds, their souls reside in the men's compounds, their inheritance and the children stay with the husband. It becomes this kind of layering of factors that becomes quite determinative of people's agency and lives. Not entirely, but if you think about it, one of the points the film makes is Kiwati, the Dharma's first wife, really the main reason she was able to get away, but she was in this Nyantana marriage, that there were no men, so he was brought into the house. So when they got divorced, she was able to keep her children and her property. Yeah. So the
inheritance part. Yeah.
I do think that there are differences between the laws of adat, which we were talking about earlier, which are traditional laws, provincial laws, and then national laws. And these many of these laws are both the traditional, the adat of the village or of the community, and national. And they're unfortunately sometimes different and not always. One thing that I'm curious about, because in Balinese culture, community is really important, and the banjar is really important. That component, I'm wondering what, did you find that, you may have decided not to use it in the film, but did you find that another factor on both sides, both in terms of people coming out and people feeling reluctant?
Yeah, we were certainly interested in what avenues women have in a traditional society if they want to seek some sort of change or change some sort of condition in their life. And we were hoping originally that because so many aspects of family are governed by adat, right, by customary law, local law, that would provide an avenue that they could turn to. But it really turned out that even on that level, the community, the head of the village, are not relatively unwilling to intervene in family affairs. And so it turned out that customary law, which could in some cases be protective of people's rights, turns out not to be a particularly effective recourse. And then I think Liv is much more knowledgeable about Indonesian national laws, it refers to family and children and marriage. So,
yeah, the national law on marriage actually requires consent from the first wife, and it was really obvious that that consent never happened, and so I don't understand how maybe in the customary law it was allowed, but in the marriage law, the national marriage law, you need the first wife's consent unless the first wife is not able to have a child or is terminally ill. So so I was actually wondering about that. But also the other thing is we now have the domestic violence law, which was enacted in 2004, which was helpful in trying to get services across Indonesia. We have police women's desks and some of the bigger police stations. We have in hospitals, in maybe bigger hospitals, we have women's crisis center for women and children. And we have legal aid offices and also psychosocial services. So in terms of services, we are getting more. We have a few shelters, but we actually need more because more and more women are actually reporting some kind of violence that they're experiencing.
It's incredibly important to tell these stories. I would say that most women and most marriages that I've encountered in Bali have been very strong, and that the community is very strong. And so maybe that's one of the reasons it makes it so difficult for women to come out, whether it's in Bali or in other parts of Indonesia. And I think it's so important, the work that you're doing, that provides that space.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about in concrete terms about the work.
Yeah. We have also tried to involve religious leaders and also in PART or RW.
The sort of local heads of the community,
neighborhood, to understand what their role is in protecting women. And so when women come to them saying that they are being beaten, they understand and they could actually intervene and try to negotiate with the husband to stop the violence. Because a lot of the women do not want to leave the marriage. They just want the violence to stop. And so the role of religious leaders are very important, although it's it's still a process. In progress, because it's difficult to kind of. I guess anything that's related to gender issues is always very political. Yeah.
It feels like there have been major changes, as I mentioned earlier, in Bali, and maybe this is my prejudice. When I see a lot of tattoos, I think of a different lifestyle because that was not the tradition. So, I think of, and these kind of brothels, which you mentioned, which have started to emerge. Giving other kinds of opportunities. Do you feel that in some ways the society has changed in ways that are harder to control now? Particularly,
Go ahead.
Well, particularly in Bali, I'm just thinking about the kind of all the people that are coming in and out, and the kind of access people have.
Yeah. The globalization. The mass tourism it's a double-edged sword. It's both centrifugal, it's pulling things apart and pushing things together. On the positive side, certainly globalization has spurred a lot of kind of cultural revitalization in Bali in terms of the arts, and there's a lot of that has become very deeply commodified. But it also brings a lot of money into villages, and then the villages, as you know, will then put on more and more complex, elaborate ritual spectacles. But also goes into scholarship and into supporting a lot of cultural forms that may have gone by the wayside without that sort of support. On the other hand, I mean, they're putting a new airport in Bali, in North Bali, that's going to bring in, right now, Negoro Rai takes 2 or 3 million tourists in. The new airport, they report, is going to take 10 to 15 million tourists. So one can imagine the kind of devastation that it'll wreak throughout having, I mean, an island of 4 million having 15 million tourists. It's kind of almost unbelievable.
Yeah.
And,
it is, and the society and the ecology cannot handle it. They can't handle it now.
Yeah.
And there are the groups that we've worked with now, several generation of Balinese scholars, filmmakers, activists, and we're working, the younger generation is doing this Tolak Reklamasi project, which is really one of the first really indigenous anti-development movement. I mean, it's kind of, we're getting a little away from what the film's about, but there are these movements, you know, to confront this rampant and in some ways, you know, really unregulated development that's occurring in Bali.
Well, this is a question for both of you. There are activists who are really involved, whether it's the women's movement or human rights movement in Bali and in Indonesia writ large. If you could talk about some of that work, because I think they are, you know, like Pat Dagung, there are people there who are really passionate about education and about providing services for people.
Yeah, I would just say with the fall of Suharto's New Order regime, which really put an incredible damper on any sort of activism of any sort. Since the democratic revitalization in the late 90s, I think you've seen many dimensions, and I probably, Livia, you wouldn't have been able to do the work you were doing under the New Order. In fact, it started.
It started in May because of the '98,
right?
And because not only the riots and lootings that happened, but women were sexually assaulted, and so it was some activists who then went to Mr. B.J. Habibie to say that there needs to be a national commission specifically working on violence against women issues, and that was when Komnas Perempuan, or National Commission Anti-Violence Against Women, was established on a presidential decree. And what the commission does is actually they have different kind of streams of activities. I was part of the National Commission. That's why I know in terms of the trying to education and also pushing for the national law, because that national law actually took 10 years before it was actually enacted in 2004, and also kind of like going into communities and then trying to see what services are available. And it was then that the issue of gender-based violence was spoken about in a more, like not hush-hush, but people were able to speak about it. And also that we saw a lot of women's organizations mushroomed during that time because of the needs. It suddenly, women were kind of like had the strength to speak up against what they were experiencing.
It was so great to have the voice of Ibu Anggreni in the film, because she's so clear and she's so strong and she's so involved. Let me open it up to the audience, and please wait for the microphone because we are recording. So here, and I'll come to you next.
May I ask a question about extent of violence against women? Of course, we know about domestic violence in our own country, unfortunately. But in terms of, are they basically primarily limited with kind of a beating up rather than severely injured or maybe even murdered?
The extent of domestic violence?
Domestic violence?
Yes, in terms of domestic violence.
Well, I think I have not heard of a household study, because to determine prevalence of domestic violence, but there have been small studies, and my dissertation is actually also on domestic violence, and I think there's no specific number because of the reason, we need to do an extensive household survey, and I think one of the UN agencies is still talking about that, but the World Health Organization is estimating that 1 in 5 actually the global prevalence, and some countries are higher than others. There was one that was conducted by WHO, but unfortunately that time they didn't include Indonesia, so we still cannot speak of the prevalence right now.
Well, thank you so much for sharing the film and these stories with us. Really appreciate the opportunity to see this. I'm hoping that you can speak a little bit more about the legal landscape and both kind of how the law, one, can potentially play a role in assisting women. I was interested with the role of the lawyer in the film in particular, and also saying how the one husband would trust the boss and then maybe a lawyer who he respected. And I was surprised to see especially a female lawyer at the table there with the mediation. So I'm wondering maybe if you can speak a little bit about that, and I don't know if maybe anything actually did come of that conversation. And I guess on a more general level, you spoke about customary law and national law. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about if there is an institutional, constitutional hierarchy in Indonesia of international law, national law, customary law, and if there is a way to use the law to help rather than just to hinder.
Okay, so we have a law on the elimination of violence against, penghapusan kekerasan terhadap perempuan. So we actually have a law on the elimination of domestic violence, in which that law kind of gave people like our legal aid lawyer more strength in kind of negotiating with perpetrators of violence because it is actually punishable by law. And then it is recognized that domestic violence constitutes of physical, psychological, economical, and also sexual violence. And so that's all in the 2004 law. And I'm not a lawyer, so I can't really speak too much on the different kinds of laws, but I understand that this law, the 2004 law, has been able to protect more women, and also has pushed different ministries to put in more money in terms of setting up services for women and children. And so, as I said before, there are hospital-based crisis centers, and also police women's desk, in which we have police officers who are trained, and we also have the Ministry of Health, for example, training primary health center health workers to understand the signs of domestic violence. So yeah, so it's actually it's still a work in progress, as everything is, I suppose. And Indonesia is a large country. We have 240 million people. And we have a lot of remote islands, and it's always accessibility, and also local resources are always problematic. And now we have the situation in which Indonesia is a middle-income country, so a lot of donors have they've gone somewhere else, and well, the civil society organizations are not ready, and especially with women's issues, as I said, it's a lot of times it's very political, and it also needs decision makers, policy makers, which are sensitized to this issue, because the experience of talking to parliamentarians, for example, when we were trying to push for this law to be in effect, was a tiring process because the victim blaming was rampant, and you want to keep your cool and not scream, but sometimes they come up with like really interesting comments, and that makes you really want to. I mean, it takes time, I guess, to make them understand.
In the very back.
I'm wondering, in the rest of Indonesia, which is primarily Muslim, what is the rate of polygamy in the rest of Indonesia?
I mean, polygamy is legal, and I think it would depend on a regency by regency basis. I think what's much more common is nikah siri, or kind of community
under the table.
Yeah, we have
under the table.
we have a film actually called "Standing on the Edge of the Thorn," which is about kind of how children get brought into the sex trade. But at the base, one of the structural conditions is this 15, 16-year-old young woman became pregnant out of wedlock, and then when that happens in rural areas, there's really very few choices. You're either sent out of the village into the city to work into the sex trade, or perhaps in domestic work, but many of the sex workers in the large cities like Jakarta or Surabaya were from this sort of background, or you're married off to anyone who will take you, because it's just a status that's really not much allowed in the village. And the film turned on the issue that the much more 35-year-old older husband who took this young girl was unwilling to marry her in a formal marriage. And that was everything turned on that status of marriage or community marriage, which doesn't come with many of the protections or status issues that a formal religious marriage would come with. So,
yeah.
That being said, though, I don't think it would be fair to say that polygamy is hugely popular or a major part of Indonesian culture. So I wouldn't want anyone to think that this wasn't really kind of an aberration.
It's still frowned upon, and we were talking about a certain religious leader whose popularity kind of like and went down the drain because he took on another wife, but I think we know that several Muslim scholars are trying to see that ayah to say that it actually says that if you can be just, or else then
equal, right?
Yes,
to treat each of them equally,
but in terms of your heart, which is impossible. So so I think some actually just want to read the first part, which says if you want to save orphans, then you can take 2, 3, or 4, but only if you can be just, and if you can treat them, or just do not do that.
So I'm going to take just 2 more, and I'm going to take you and the woman up there. Okay, so you have the microphone, and then I'll come back to you.
Just one. I have a question, but first of all, isn't the fact that Bali is Hindu related to the rest of Indonesia? Does that have some role with the issue of polygamy? But that wasn't my question.
Well, just in a simple way, in Islamic law, you can have 4 wives, but that's the max. In Bali, there's no limit per se. Well, there's adat limitations, but there are apocryphal stories, kind of like of King Solomon with 999 wives. There are stories of men with many, many, many wives.
Okay. Actually, my question My question was about the methodology in terms of interviewing. I think I saw in the film that the male anthropologist was interviewing as well as somebody else in the community who was male. And yet in the credits I saw that there were both foreign and local female interviewers, but they were not shown in the film. So I was curious why you had male interviewers of the women. Maybe it was just in the film that you showed it and not female interviewers. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you about in terms of interviewing, placing the husband and the wife together to be interviewed. Was there any coercion on the part of the wife to respond with the husband there, and how did that affect the quality or veracity of the interview? And wouldn't it have been better to interview them separately to get their stories rather than together? Those are my questions.
Yeah, I'm not the question of male versus female. I mean, there were multiple interviewers. I did a lot of interviews. Mm-hmm. I think Livia did interviews. I mean, we had probably Nina. I mean, we had many. Because I worked with a kind of team over a number of years. I'm not. I mean, I kind of understand where you're going. You should have women interview women, men, but not really. It's more. No, there's women off camera who are doing the interviewing. Yeah. I'm sorry.
They're not shown on camera.
Yeah, I don't think any of the interviewers are actually shown on camera. I mean, as a filmmaker, you have to understand that I've done many films with many forms of narration, many forms of interviewing. Mm-hmm. You know, we have films with no narration, kind of more sensory ethnography. We have continuous narration, intermittent narration. We have interviewers shown, not shown. You kind of you make a kind of a stylistic decision about the project, and that's what you go with. But I think you go with what works in terms of, you know, you have as a researcher, a filmmaker, you have a range of methods that you draw on, and I'm not particularly ideological about which ones I pick or don't pick. And there was a second part of the question.
Why did you interview the husband and the wife together in this particular situation? Right. And was there any coercion on the part of the wife to answer since the husband was there and you're having problems in the marriage?
Sure.
None of the women were happy with their situations.
Well, we interviewed in a variety of situations.
But this is what you show in the film. We don't know that it relates
that's
back
not
to
true. You see women alone. You see women with their husbands. You see multiple women with their husbands. You see women with their children. We're not just showing one thing. We're showing the range of interview situations, and not the full range, because we did hundreds of hours of interviews. So maybe you're just remembering certain representative interviews and not others, but there's a range shown.
But we'll have a chance to come back.
Yeah.
Actually, this woman here, and then we're going to go to the reception where we have time to talk in more detail one-on-one.
Hi. When you did the interviews, because this took place over 7 years of interviews, was it your original intention to focus on the issues that ultimately you did focus on, or were you interviewing these families for other reasons prior to deciding to use some of the interviews and then maybe focus it more on some of the issues that did ultimately come to be the focus of the movie?
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways you can approach a film. You can approach a film with a very specific idea of what you want, very specific storylines that you can map out to a greater or lesser degree, and that's what you go for. As an anthropologist, we tend to view it, that reality is much more emergent, and the stories develop more organically out of the material rather than looking for specific. That said, I think one of the reasons that we focused on families where there was a greater or lesser degree of genderized violence is, as I mentioned in the beginning, that was kind of the initial impetus, the initial push, was to explore that issue. And it just so happened that a number of our initial subjects in Bali were also in polygamous unions. Mm-hmm. Though I wouldn't want anyone to think that, and as the film says, that genderized violence is specific to these sort of kinship arrangements, which it's not. Yeah. It's arguable whether the rates are even higher in polygamous unions or not. But these were the stories that we drew from for the film. So you don't have an unlimited, you work with what's in front of your nose at some point. Yeah.
That was part of my question is, did you originally start to interview these particular families because you were interested in polygamous families, or because you were interested in something else?
No, because we were interested in gender-based violence.
Gender-based violence. I think Rob started with gender-based violence in Jakarta, and also looking into the mass rapes that happened in May, but that became too difficult because people were still afraid to speak.
Yeah.
And then he found subjects in Bali who were in polygamous marriages.
Yeah, I'm finished, 90% finished with a book that discusses these issues in great depth, in great detail. But ethnographic film is always tied to ethnography. It's one thing that distinguishes documentary from ethnographic film is that documentary film ideally should stand on its own. You shouldn't have to read anything. But as an anthropologist engaged in active research, it actually frees you up in some ways, because you can put a lot of the material in the written word that you can refer back to. And right now, what we're trying to kind of pioneer is a kind of a synthesized form using ebooks that you have films, clips, outtakes, and written ethnography in one place, so you can watch the film in the ebook. You can read, you can watch clips as they kind of organically emerge from the narrative of the ethnography itself. So we're trying to do a kind of a merged form, which I think will be the future of ethnography proper in 5 or 10 years.
Well, I want to thank you. I think it's a very powerful story. Just thinking about this ebook, an online interactive component, it allows for your work and the work that is with the service organizations that is so crucial to come into play, and for people to understand, in this instance, Balinese culture, whereas the film itself is really about 3 families and the case studies, and not writ large. And I think you are on to something that's very powerful. Thank you so much.